Okay, all right. Then welcome to the session on formal protocol analysis. I'm Pedram Hosseyni, PhD student at the Institute of Information Security of the University of Stuttgart in Germany. And in this session, I will give some background information on formal protocol analysis. And we will also talk about two of the current analyses that we are doing right now. One is on self-issued OpenID providers, and the other one is on the GNAP protocol. So we start with an overview about formal protocol analysis, and we will see why this is a useful technique. And as this is a broad field, I will focus on two frameworks that our institute is working on. The first one is the web infrastructure model, a pen and paper model that we use for many analyses so far. And actually, one of these analyses also initiated the OAuth security workshop some years ago. And as already mentioned, we are doing two analyses right now, and we will give a brief overview on the current status of these. As already said, the web infrastructure model, or just WIM, is a pen and paper model, and we currently started to mechanize this framework. And we created the foundation for that already, and this is the DY star framework, and I will give an overview of this too. So let's start with what formal protocol analysis actually does. And before we do that, let's start with a motivation. So let's see why we even need formal methods. So one of the main questions, especially if you are designing protocols, is how can you find vulnerabilities? And you always have to consider that your protocol or implementation is typically running in a larger context. So for OAuth, this is often the web, where you have many different participants, browsers, different kind of servers, DNS servers, also malicious parties. And the question is, how can you find vulnerabilities and attacks? And one method is to do an expert review. So just a second, I think, now the slide works again. So in an expert review, some expert goes through some known attacks and checks if your implementation or protocol is vulnerable to these attacks. So another really useful method is to do pen testing. And the pen tester would then try to break into the system and attack the system. So both methods are really useful in practice, and they make it possible to find many vulnerabilities in a short period of time. But these methods also have some downsides. So one obvious downside is that it is easy to miss attacks, even for experts. And also these methods typically focus on attacks that are already known. So it's really hard to find new attacks. And finding new kinds of attacks would depend on the creativity of the analyst. And also, none of these methods guarantees security, not even for a limited set of attacks. So the question is, can we find a more systematic way to find vulnerabilities and attacks? And also to prove that the system, or in our context, we mainly look at the protocol, if the protocol is secure. And in the end, the goal is to have a mathematical proof of security. And this is possible by using formal methods. So let's see what the basic principle of formal protocol analysis is. And this explanation is not really depending on a specific framework, but is general. So typically when doing a formal protocol analysis, the framework that we are using provides you with a model for the overall system and network. So for example, the framework defines how the network works, how messages are sent and received, how the state management of the protocol participants works. And this is usually the foundation of the analysis. Then on top of this, you have to create the application-specific model. So let's say we want to analyze OAuth. Then you would create from the OAuth RFCs this specification, this application-specific model. So you would create a model for the OAuth client, the OAuth authorization server, and so on. Once we have this, we are able to define security properties. So the good thing here is that the model is a formal model, so everything is well defined. And that makes it possible to precisely define what formal security properties we want to have. And well, now the goal is to prove these properties within the model, within the framework. And this is really a mathematical proof of these properties. So we essentially want to show that for all attackers that are captured by the framework, these security properties are satisfied. But it might be that this fails. And if that happens, then you might find attacks, even new attacks. And what you would do then is you would come up with fixes, often together with the corresponding working group. And then you can incorporate these fixes into the application-specific model. And then you continue the proof until you have the final proof of security. And with this approach, it is possible to find even new kinds of attacks. And this does not depend on the creativity of the analyst. And that means at the same time that once you have the proof, that you have really strong security guarantees and that you can even exclude unknown kinds of attacks, at least within the framework. So far, this was a general overview on what formal protocol analysis does conceptually. And next, let's look at the web infrastructure model, which essentially defines the foundation for the formal analysis. So going back to the pyramid, we can see that the bottom layer is now the WIM. And well, let's take a more detailed look at the WIM. So our group started to develop the WIM in 2014. And the WIM is the most comprehensive model of the web infrastructure. So it models the network, it models browsers, web servers, DNS servers, also attackers that can control single entities, but also an attacker that can control the whole network. The WIM is a so-called Dolev-Yao style model. And here an important aspect is that messages are formal and well-defined terms. But the WIM is not just a standard Dolev-Yao model, but it covers many, many web features, which we will see now. So let's take a closer look at what features the browser model of the WIM models. So the browser models DNS, HTTP, HTTPS, also the whole window and document structure of browsers. It models scripts that can be honest or malicious, and many, many more features like different kind of storages, different kind of headers. And well, I won't go into details in that talk, but yeah, as you can see, there are many web features that are modeled in the WIM. And so far, this is more abstract. And maybe you ask yourself, okay, well, but how does the browser model now look like actually? And here we have a simple example. I won't go into details of everything, but the goal is to just give you an intuition on how a part of the model looks like in the WIM. So this is the part of the browser model which models how an HTTP response is processed. So this function has as an input the response and some more arguments. And well, it starts by looking into the headers of the response. So it first sees if there is a set cookie in the HTTP response and then sets the cookie accordingly. And yeah, here you can see that there is a function called add cookie. And this function itself is, again, well-defined and also close to the corresponding web standard. And it models how a new cookie is added to the set of old cookies, or to the set of existing cookies. So yeah, the browser also models many more headers like strict transport security, referrer header, location header, different kind of status codes, the origin header, and many, many more things. So this was just a small part of the whole model. And the point here is that this is not just some pseudocode, but everything is well defined and also within a system. So it is well defined what the network does, and it is well defined what the attacker does and can do. So before talking about the two analyses that we are currently doing, let's take a brief look at the analysis that we already did with the WIM so far. And while the first time the WIM was used to analyze a protocol was for analyzing the Mozilla browser ID system. And again, I won't go into details of these case studies, but just give a brief overview. So in this analysis, our group found out that there are severe attacks, and also found out that privacy, which was the main design goal of the system, was broken beyond repair. So then our group decided to design a new single sign-on system called Espresso. And this is the first single sign-on system that is provably secure and also provides strong authentication and privacy properties. Then our group decided to analyze OAuth, and well, we found 4 new attacks: the 307 redirect attack, the IDP mix-up attack, and 2 attacks on session integrity. So our group proposed fixes, and we were able to prove that the fixed protocol is secure within the WIM. And also the attacks were so severe that the working group decided to meet with our group, and this meeting was, well, the beginning of the OAuth security workshop, so essentially the 0th OSW. Then our group analyzed OpenID Connect, and we were able to prove that the protocol is secure. And then we continued with the financial grade API, and we found out that the financial grade API 1.0 is not as secure as it aimed to be. So we found 3 new attacks, and again proposed fixes, and we're able to show that the fixed protocol is secure. So the last analysis we finished was on the web payment API, which is a browser-assisted checkout protocol. Again, I won't go into details here, but as you might already guess, we found 2 new attacks on this protocol, and again proposed fixes and proved the security of the fixed protocol. And yes, as you can see, when analyzing a protocol with the WIM, it's possible to find new attacks and also prove the security of protocols. And this is because the analysis is systematic and considers really all possible attacks, even those that are not known yet. So this is really what the benefit is when doing a formal analysis, protocol analysis. All right, so next we will look at the current status of the 2 analyses that we are doing right now. So one is on self-issued OpenID providers by Christina Bauer, and the other one is the analysis of GNAP by Florian Helmschmidt. So both are master's theses. And yes, so we start with Christina, who will give a brief overview on the current status of her thesis.
Hi, so I'm doing my master thesis with a topic formal analysis of self-issued OpenID providers. And for this, I'll first give a quick introduction what self-issued OpenID providers are. And well, first, it's a specification by the OpenID Connect working group, which is currently in draft state. And it extends OpenID Connect by identity providers that are in the end user's local control. So instead of a trusted IDP, ID tokens now are signed by the end user's private credentials. And also self-issued OpenID providers are built with support for verifiable presentations in mind, meaning that there can also be additional claims provided by a trusted issuer. And self-issued OpenID providers come with 2 protocol variants, namely this is the same device flow and the cross-device flow. And there's a quick sketch of the same device flow on the next slide. We see the same device flow is characterized by, well, the browser of the serving as the user agent and the self-issued OpenID provider residing on the same end user device. And we also see that this flow is based on the OpenID Connect implicit flow. Yes, so then the next slide, there are an overview of, there is an overview of the current state of my thesis. So currently I'm in the modeling phase, where I build a model of the self-issued OpenID providers same device flow, and currently I'm covering features like the discovery of self-issued OpenID providers and the registration of the RP by value and by reference, which are options provided in the current SIOP spec, which both have to be done per a registration flow here, because there's no pre-established, or not necessarily a pre-established connection between self-issued provider and RP. And then also I support the model supports signed request objects, and then the two types of ID tokens, the called subject syntax types, JKTs, I'm not sure if that's the correct pronunciation, and based on the centralized identifiers. And also my model, what I'm currently working on in the model is a basic support for verifier representations. And next is then the definition of the formal security properties. Now you see that I'm only supporting the model currently only is for the same device flow, and the next slide is about why. So in the security considerations document of for SIOP of the working group, there is this attack I have sketched here. In short, the attacker can start an authentication flow for the cross-device flow with a relying party, and if they can convince the self-issued OpenID providers of the of an honest end user to scan that QR code and authenticate, they log in the attacker in their session. So currently I cannot prove the security of that. And what's next then? Well, you think about possible mitigations, and I have come up with a bit of an idea what you could do there, but that's for the session on cross-device flows tomorrow. So I give back to Pedram now.
All right, thank you very much. So then Florian will present his current status on the GNAP analysis.
Yes, so I'm looking at KNAP as part of my master's thesis. And as already heard in the invited talk earlier today, now the slide isn't switching, I think.
Oh yeah.
Right. As already heard in the invited talk earlier today, KNAP stands for Grant Negotiation and Authorization Protocol.
Could you maybe turn up your microphone a bit?
Yeah, sure. Is it better now?
That's a bit better, yeah.
Okay. The abstract of KNAP reads as follows. KNAP defines a mechanism for delegating authorization to a piece of software and conveying that delegation to the software. This delegation can include access to a set of APIs, as well as information passed directly to the software. Now here's an example flow of KNAP. In this flow, we have a client instance, an authorization server, and a resource server, which are roles defined by the protocol, and also a user who is a human. This flow is started by the client instance that requests access from the authorization server, that then determines that interaction is required for this request. So the client instance then redirects the user to the authorization server and displays a, oh no, sorry, the client instance displays a user code to the user that it has received from the authorization server in its response. The user can then open a URI of the authorization server on a second device, authenticate himself to the authorization server, and then enter that user code on the web page of the authorization server. The authorization server then uses that user code to associate the interaction with the grant request made by the client instance. The user can then authorize the request, and after that, the authorization server will send a post request to the client instance, informing it that the interaction with the user has completed and that it can now continue its request. After the client instance continued its request, the authorization server grants access to the client instance by issuing an access token. With this access token, the client instance can then access the API of the resource server. Now in this flow, the messages 3, 4, and 6 are part of the so-called user code interaction start mode, which is just one of several start modes that GNAP already has defined and that can be interchanged. And message 9 is sent when using the push interaction finish mode, where there's also another finish mode defined. So KNAP is rather versatile in this regard. What or how far have I come with my analysis? I almost completed my model of KNAP in the web infrastructure model. And in this model, I covered the following features. Regarding start modes, I covered the redirect mode and the user code mode. And for finish modes, I covered both the redirect mode and the push interaction finish mode. Next to keybound access tokens and bearer tokens, I also modeled the possibility of an authorization server to return subject identifiers to the client instance. As key proofs, I implemented HTTP message signatures, detached JWS, and MTLS with both asymmetric and symmetric keys. I also covered the software-only authorization mode, where a grant process happens without any user involvement. And I also implemented token introspection. So now the next step will be to define security properties for KNAP. What results has my work yielded so far? I submitted multiple pull requests and issues on GitHub to remove some inconsistencies and remnants from previous versions of the core protocol. And these are the numbers of the pull requests and the issues. And then I also found that 2 attacks on similar protocols can also be applied to KNAP. Namely, those are Cuckoo's token attack on the OpenID financial grade API and the 307 redirect attack on OAuth 2.0, which both have been found using the Vim as we've just seen. And then I also submitted a pull request to add security considerations on HTTP redirect status codes in order to prevent the 307 redirect attack. Now I will give a brief overview of Cuckoo's token attack. The main assumption of this attack is that the attacker somehow obtains a leaked access token bound to a key of an honest client instance, with which the resources of an honest user can be accessed. And the impact of this attack is then that the attacker can circumvent the token binding for this access token. The attack then works as follows. The attacker starts a session with that honest client instance, which then requests access from an authorization server that is controlled by the attacker. This is possible if the client instance is configured to use multiple authorization servers. The authorization server then answers with exactly that access token that the attacker somehow has obtained. And now the problem is that the client instance will use this access token in this session at the resource server. And the resource server now grants access to the resources of that honest user for whom this access token has been issued. So through the client instance, the attacker now also has access to the resources of that honest user. And the 307 redirect attack is a bit simpler. Here, the user sends confidential data in a post body to the authorization server. The authorization server then redirects the user to the client instance using the HTTP 307 redirect status code. And the problem now is that that confidential data is reposted to the client instance, because when using the 307 redirect status code, the body of the post request is not dropped from the request, but kept in it. So now the client instance can exploit the obtained data, for example, to impersonate the user at the authorization server.
All right. So thanks, Christina and Florian, for presenting your work. So far, the WIM is a pen and paper model, and there is no tool support for it yet. But we already started to mechanize the WIM, and so far we created the foundation for it, which is dy star. And dy star is written in the F star programming language. And if you haven't heard of that yet, that's a functional programming language aimed at program verification, and it's developed mainly by Microsoft Research and INRIA. And dy star is the first Doleviao style framework that was ever written in F star, and it leverages many benefits provided by the F star language. And we will see some features of dy star on the next slide. So far, this is a basic Doleviao model, and the next steps that we are working on is to mechanize the WIM based on dy star. So looking at some of the features, it's important that dy star focuses on both the protocol core and also on implementation aspects. So I won't go into details of all features here, but the main point is that dy star overcomes many of the limitations of already existing tools. For example, because the framework is based on F star, which is a fully fledged programming language, we can create models that essentially are implementations. That means that we can do an implementation level analysis. We can also reason about unbounded structures, like unbounded data structures, and also loops in the protocol. Also, the proofs are modular, and the proofs are executable, so we can test the models. And they are even interoperable. So we will see an example on that soon on the next slide. And we have many more features that I won't discuss in this talk. So far we used dy star to analyze several protocols. Again, I won't go into details here, but just give an overview. And the first analysis we did was on the Signal protocol. And here we showed both forward secrecy and post-compromise security. So two properties that are really essential to the Signal protocol. And we also analyzed the ACME protocol, which is, for example, used by Let's Encrypt to issue certificates. And here, the model is so detailed that it can even interoperate with Let's Encrypt servers. So that means that we were able to get valid certificates from Let's Encrypt. And beside of these two large analyses, we also analyzed some smaller protocols like Needham-Schroeder, ISO-DH, and ISO-CHEM. So with this, let me conclude our presentation. So we looked at some basic principles of formal protocol analysis. We also looked at the WIM, some of the already existing analysis, but also on the two current analysis, so on self-issued OpenID providers and on KNAP. We also looked at the dy star framework, some of the analysis we already did using dy star. And as already said, the goal is to use dy star as a foundation for mechanizing the WIM. So this was the presentation part of that session. Thank you very much for your attention. Do you have any questions or comments?
現在の時刻は7時30分です。現在江東区は気温16度、雨です。今日は予想最高気温20度。
Nat, we're getting some background noise. There we go.
So I'm sorry, but I couldn't understand the question.
Sorry, it's 7:30 and Google speaker started to speak.
Mm-hmm.
So this is Justin Richer. I have a question for the researchers here. First, I wanted to speak on behalf of the editors of the KNAP specification and thank you guys for getting involved with the work and doing this analysis and poking holes into things. This is very, very valuable work, especially on something that is not completely calcified yet as KNAP is, because there's a chance that we can fix things that are more foundational as opposed to just trying to paste fixes on after the fact. As an example, there was another researcher who found out that there was a variant of the mix-up attack that KNAP was susceptible to previously that's being patched in OAuth by the issue parameter in the return that KNAP could actually fix in a more fundamental way. And so that was really nice to be able to address that and not have to bolt things back on. Anyway, my question to the researchers is, what are your plans for continuing engagement with these specifications as they grow and change? So while we don't anticipate there being massive changes to the KNAP core protocol at this stage, as we all know, sometimes subtle changes can have really outmoded knock-on effects, especially to the security modeling. So what, if any, are the plans for ongoing engagement?
Yeah, so thank you very much for your feedback. And well, let me begin with saying that, so essentially both of the analyses are going into the interesting part now, which is like proving the properties. And that's usually when most of the attacks are found. So on your question about like the ongoing development. So when doing an analysis, it's possible to update the model part as long as there are some basic changes. But at some point when like proving the security properties, so that's where we really need a snapshot of the protocol. And yes, so if like say that KNAP changes completely in like 1 or 2 years, then it might be possible that we could reuse some parts of the existing analysis and basically adapt that to the new protocol. So that basically depends on how much the protocol would change. Yes. But in principle, that's something that we always take into account, and that's always an option to do so. Okay, any more comments or questions?
There's one question in the chat.
Where can I find the chat? Let me see.
Maybe I can comment on that one. So that's a question on the WebAuthn protocol. We actually had a student look at the WebAuthn protocol, but this was not a Vim style analysis, but a more informal analysis. But in principle, we could also use the Vim to have a closer look at WebAuthn. So there is some preliminary work on that, but not based on the Vim, but kind of Vim style analysis without the full formal foundation underneath. But that's probably also something quite interesting to look at. And I think from that analysis, there was also some feedback going to the working group, if I remember correctly. So there were some parts that were a bit imprecise in the standard, and I think the working group updated these parts based on the feedback our student gave.
There's another question in the chat.
Could you please read that out, because I'm not able to open the chat for some reason.
Mark,
I can read that out, yes. Yeah. Thank you, Daniel. So as standards contributors and authors, is there a way that we can be more deterministic in our definitions of the specs?
Oh, yes. So there are many things. And so this is also...
Sorry to interrupt. Is the first thing not use English?
Well, the question is what to use instead. So you would need like a more precise formalization of the protocol. So one thing that also I think Daniel Fett can comment more on is because he like also when working with the OAuth working group added a bit of input. Like so one thing that is really helpful is to create really and write down explicitly what kind of security guarantees the protocol should fulfill. And so this also means that you really need to create a clear model of what attackers you have in mind. So for example, for the financial grade API, this was done to some degree, like saying that, okay, so the protocol aims to be secure even if access tokens leak, and also some things are misconfigured. And yeah, so this is one part that would really help whoever analyzes protocols to explicitly write down what kind of security guarantees do you want to achieve, and under which assumptions, under which attackers, basically. I think that's the most important part, at least from my experience. So the second question I think was more on like writing it down. So far I haven't. So I think like that's the style in which RFCs are written down right now, for example, are really okay. I don't think that's too imprecise, at least from my opinion. So sure, there are some specifications that really write down things in pseudocode, which at some parts might help. Yes, but the most important thing from my experience is to have a clear goal written down, like what kind of security do you want to achieve? Any more comments from the audience?
Maybe I can also add one more thing to that. So in some parts, the specifications are designed to capture a huge variety of different use cases. And in the working groups, there is a lot of discussion going on certain use cases and reasoning why certain options exist in the standard. But sometimes all this information, all the reasoning behind certain standardization decisions is not fully reflected in the standard. So I remember when we had a look at the OAuth specification, when we carried out the Vim analysis of OAuth, we were wondering why certain options even exist, and if they are actually used in practice, or if they are just leftovers from some, say, deprecated use cases. And for OAuth, indeed, there are some of these modes which are deprecated or will become deprecated. For example, the resource owner password credential grant is probably a good example for that. That was included in OAuth as a kind of mechanism to for legacy applications. And when you look at these specifications and you don't have all the knowledge from how this specification evolved during its creation, then sometimes you're sitting there and wondering how is this feature actually supposed to be used. So for resource owner password credentials grant, this is kind of clear, but for other features, it's probably not that clear. And if somebody takes a look at the specification later on, years later even, then some parts might be a bit hard to understand. So adding some kind of reasoning or giving some use cases for certain features, especially the ones which are optional, that is probably also helpful just to get a grasp or an understanding of the whole protocol. This is not a thing that's so relevant for formal analysis, but it's something that is quite relevant when you're new to a standard and trying to fully understand everything.
I think to add just one more thing, in general, if a standard is easy to implement, it's probably also easy to analyze. And one big factor, of course, is to be precise. Another factor is to reduce optionality. So essentially what we did with FAPI2, for example. So both explicit optionality, where the standard says do this or that, and implicit optionality, where the standard says do whatever you want. So trying to reduce that helps tremendously in writing a model, because you essentially have less code paths to analyze.
Yeah, maybe the HTML standard is also a good example for that. I remember the first version of HTML5. There were some very complicated statements on when some script is able to access certain other windows. This has been now changed to an algorithmic style description. And this makes it much more easier. And this is exactly what you're saying, Daniel, like stating in the spec or giving in the spec already an idea on how to implement it, making it easy to implement. And if you have certain more complicated parts in the specification, and just if you then just write it down as in an algorithm style, that is already very helpful.
Going back to a comment that Pedram made before about the rate of change in KNAP. So speaking as a co-chair of the working group, I don't expect the protocol to change all that much, but I do encourage the researchers to coordinate snapshots with the protocol editors. We did that for TLS 1.3. There was a snapshot that was specifically for formal verification. We can do it for GNAP. I think it would be valuable.
All right, thank you very much for your input. Yes.